Iran's hidden civil war just went public, the funeral that exposed the regime's split. Something happened in Tehran this week that Iran's government never wanted the world to see. In front of international news cameras, at a state funeral meant to project unity and strength, two rival factions inside the Islamic Republic turned on each other in public. Police loyal to the government arrested people loyal to the military wing of the regime. Crowds broke into competing chants. And by the end of the day, the story being broadcast out of Iran was no longer about mourning a fallen leader. It was about a government that can no longer hide the fact that it is fighting itself. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand something that rarely gets explained clearly. Iran is not run by one single unified government making one unified decision. It is run by two overlapping power centers that are often described together as the regime, but which do not actually agree with each other on the most important question facing the country right now, whether to negotiate with the United States or whether to keep pushing toward confrontation. This week, that disagreement stopped being a quiet, internal argument. It became a public spectacle, playing out in real time in front of the cameras of major international networks. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence of events tells you everything about where the real power struggle inside Iran currently stands. The funeral in question was for a senior Iranian religious and political figure. And it took place in Tehran with large crowds gathering around a central square in the city, an area that has become the traditional gathering point for state-organized processions like this one. According to reporting on the event, tensions had been building for days between two sides. On one side stood Iran's government, represented in these negotiations by its foreign ministry, which has been engaged in diplomatic talks with the United States. On the other side stood hardline supporters aligned with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the powerful military and security organization that operates alongside and in many ways above Iran's formal civilian government. According to the material describing this event, Iran's government explicitly warned people ahead of time not to turn the funeral into a protest against the ongoing negotiations with Washington. That warning tells you something important right there. If the government felt it needed to publicly ask its own citizens not to protest against its own negotiating position, that tells you the government was already worried about losing control of the narrative and possibly losing control of the streets. That warning did not work. According to the reporting, hardline supporters showed up anyway, and instead of simply mourning, they used the funeral as a platform to chant slogans rejecting any deal with the United States, some directed personally at President Trump. Police, who nominally operate under the authority of Iran's civilian government, responded by arresting a number of the hardliners for turning the funeral into what was effectively an anti-negotiation demonstration. This is the detail that most casual observers of Iran completely miss, and it is the detail that explains everything else that followed. The police arresting IRGC-aligned demonstrators does not mean Iran's government has real, independent authority over the IRGC. It means the government is caught in an impossible position. It answers to a system where the Revolutionary Guard holds enormous military and security power that, in practice, often outweighs whatever authority the elected or appointed civilian government claims to hold. So when the government's police arrest hardliners, everyone involved understands that those arrests are likely to be brief, symbolic, and unlikely to result in any serious consequence because nobody wants to provoke a direct confrontation with the IRGC's military leadership. This is why what happened next matters so much. According to the material, chaos broke out at the funeral procession itself, with government organizers reportedly pushing back against the hardline demonstrators, leading to visible disorder in front of international media that had traveled to Tehran to cover the event, including major Western outlets. Some of the crowd members reportedly grew frustrated and began leaving the procession early, visibly unhappy with how the event had been organized and how they had been treated. Think about what it means that this level of internal disorder happened in full view of international cameras. Authoritarian governments spend enormous effort controlling the images that leave their country during major state events. A funeral like this is supposed to be a display of unity, strength, and mass public support for the regime and its leadership. Instead, what actually aired to the world was a scene of infighting, arrests, and disappointed crowds walking away. That is not a messaging failure. That is a sign of a system under real strain, one that no longer has the tight grip on public events that it is used to having. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely important beyond a single chaotic afternoon in Tehran, because this incident is not happening in isolation. It is the latest visible symptom of a much deeper divide that has existed inside Iran's leadership structure for decades, and one that has become far more dangerous in the current moment. According to the material, this split traces back generations, to the earliest years after Iran's supreme leader position was established following the 1979 revolution. The specific tension driving today's crisis is between two camps that are often labeled, loosely, as reformists or moderates on one side, and hardliners tied to the Revolutionary Guard on the other. It is worth being careful with that language because neither side represents anything close to a genuine political opposition to the Islamic Republic itself. Both camps operate within the same overall system. The real disagreement between them is tactical, not ideological. How should the regime survive the current moment of maximum pressure from the outside world? The government side, represented in these negotiations by Iran's foreign ministry, appears to be pursuing a strategy built around de-escalation. According to available reporting, the side has been actively negotiating with the United States, motivated by real fear about what continued military and economic pressure could do to the regime's survival. This is the camp that wants a deal, or at least wants to be seen actively pursuing one, because it calculates that continued confrontation carries an existential risk to the system. It depends on for power. The hardline side, tied closely to the Revolutionary Guard's military leadership, appears to be pursuing the opposite calculation. According to the material, this camp does not want negotiations, and in some readings, actively prefers continued confrontation, because it believes escalation, not de-escalation, best protects its own institutional power and survival. It is worth being precise about why that calculation might make sense from the perspective of that faction, even if it is a deeply cynical one. Military and security leadership tied to the IRGC draws its power and legitimacy specifically from the ongoing state of confrontation with the West and with Israel. A genuine, lasting deal with the United States would likely reduce the IRGC's outsized influence over Iran's economy, its foreign policy, and its domestic security apparatus. In other words, peace is a threat to this faction's power, in a way that it is not necessarily a threat to the civilian government's survival. That is the real fault line running underneath everything else happening in Iran right now. And it is the fault line that briefly became visible to the entire world at this funeral. Two factions, technically part of the same overall system, publicly disagreeing in front of international cameras about whether Iran should keep negotiating or keep fighting. This is also the moment to address something that gets consistently misreported and misunderstood whenever footage like this circulates online: the actual size and meaning of the crowd. According to the material, Iran's government and state media had promised a historic turnout, describing expectations running into the tens of millions of people. What actually materialized, according to the same reporting, was a crowd numbering in the low hundreds of thousands, concentrated mainly around a single central square, and the streets leading directly into it, not spread meaningfully across the wider city or the country. The material also describes free food, drinks, and transportation being provided to encourage turnout, a detail that itself suggests organizers were concerned about achieving the scale they wanted through voluntary participation alone. This distinction matters enormously because it is exactly the kind of footage that tends to get taken out of context once it starts circulating on social media outside Iran. A large crowd filmed from a single camera angle in a single square can look like overwhelming national support if you have no other context. But Iran has a population well above 80 million people. Even if this specific event genuinely drew several 100,000 attendees, that still represents a small fraction of the country's total population, concentrated in one location, organized with material incentives, rather than a spontaneous outpouring of national grief and loyalty spread across the country. This is the exact point that sparked confusion online in the aftermath of the funeral, with some commentators outside Iran reacting to the raw footage of crowd size by concluding that public support for the regime must be far stronger than previously assumed. That reaction misunderstands both the scale of Iran's population and the material and logistical effort that Iranian state media and security services put into producing these images in the first place. A crowd that looks large on camera, filmed from a helicopter or a single elevated angle sweeping across one square, is not the same thing as a nationwide referendum on regime support. Understanding the difference between an organized, incentivized turnout in one location and genuine mass sentiment across an entire country is exactly the kind of context that gets lost when clips travel online without it. Now, layered underneath all of this domestic political drama is the wider regional and military context that gives this moment even higher stakes. According to the material, Israel's defense establishment has publicly reaffirmed that recent military action against senior Iranian leadership figures was tied directly to concerns about Iran's stated ambitions toward Israel's destruction. And Israeli officials have indicated that military operations against IRGC leadership are expected to continue rather than end. This is presented, according to the material, not as an isolated flare-up, but as an extension of a decades-long confrontation between Israel and Iran's Islamic Republic, that both sides appear to view as unresolved and ongoing. That framing helps explain why the internal Iranian power struggle playing out at this funeral is not simply a domestic political story. It is unfolding directly inside a live, active military and diplomatic crisis involving Iran, Israel, and the United States simultaneously. The government faction negotiating with Washington is doing so under the shadow of recent military strikes against senior IRGC and religious leadership. The hardline faction rejecting those negotiations is doing so while facing the reality that its own senior leadership has already suffered direct losses. Both sides are making a bet about what comes next, and both bets carry enormous risk. It's also worth understanding, carefully and without exaggeration, why a rapid, decisive military resolution to this standoff has proven far more difficult than some outside observers initially assumed. According to the material, Iran is a large country, and past military and security crackdowns described in relation to earlier domestic uprisings, including one referenced as occurring around the end of last year and into January, reportedly resulted in a very difficult and violent crackdown once security forces regrouped and coordinated their response, with reports of security personnel brought in from outside Iran's borders to help suppress the unrest once domestic forces alone proved insufficient or unwilling. That pattern illustrates why authoritarian security structures like Iran's Revolutionary Guard can prove resilient even after suffering meaningful setbacks, because their survival strategy relies less on defeating an opponent decisively and more on outlasting pressure and adapting their tactics to absorb losses. According to the material, the leadership's approach during military conflict has similarly relied on regrouping in hardened positions while continuing limited retaliatory action, a strategy focused on demonstrating survival rather than achieving outright victory. This helps explain something important about how this story is likely to continue unfolding. A government and a security apparatus built around demonstrating resilience rather than winning outright victories does not need to defeat its opponents to remain in power. It only needs to survive long enough to prove that it has survived. And that alone becomes a kind of propaganda victory it can use domestically. That is precisely why events like this funeral matter so much as a battleground for public perception, both inside Iran and internationally. Whoever controls the narrative around events like this, whoever appears more in control, more unified, and more legitimate in the eyes of ordinary Iranians, gains real strategic advantage, even if nothing on the battlefield itself has changed. At the same time, it would be a mistake to view this internal Iranian power struggle purely through the lens of foreign pressure. According to the material, ordinary Iranians living under this system are dealing with severe, sustained hardship that predates and extends beyond the current standoff with the United States and Israel. The material describes an environment resembling a form of martial law, with security checkpoints, armed personnel stationed in public areas, and a climate where open dissent carries an immediate and serious personal risk. It also describes continued economic strain, with the country's broader economy under significant pressure, even as the regime insists on shutting down commercial activity for extended state mourning periods that many ordinary citizens reportedly cannot afford to observe, with numerous shops and businesses said to have stayed open despite official instructions to close. That detail, businesses defying a nationwide closure order tied to official mourning, deserves attention on its own, separate from anything happening at the funeral procession itself. When ordinary economic behavior starts to visibly diverge from official state instructions, even on something as symbolically important to the regime as a period of mourning for a senior figure, it tells you something meaningful about the practical limits of the government's authority over daily life. People still need income, people still need their businesses open. And when enough people quietly choose their own economic survival over compliance with a symbolic government directive, that is its own small but real signal about how much genuine authority the state actually holds over ordinary behavior, separate from its ability to project strength through organized public spectacles. This is also the moment to talk honestly about how difficult it is to get a clear, accurate picture of public sentiment inside Iran at all, from any direction. State media inside Iran has strong incentives to inflate turnout numbers and present displays of loyalty as far more widespread than independent verification can support. At the same time, footage circulating from a single event, without broader context about population size, regional distribution, or the material incentives used to encourage attendance, can just as easily be misread by outside observers in the opposite direction, either overestimating regime support because a crowd looks large on camera, or underestimating the regime's remaining base of genuine support because that base, while a minority, is still real and still numbers in the millions. The most responsible way to understand a moment like this is to hold both realities at the same time. There is a real, committed base of support for Iran's Islamic Republic, tied closely to the IRGC and to religious and security institutions that benefit directly from the current system. That base is genuinely willing to turn out, chant, and publicly demonstrate loyalty, including hostility toward the United States and toward specific American political figures. At the same time, according to the material and independent assessments referenced within it, that base likely represents a minority of Iran's overall population, a population that has shown, in previous waves of protest and unrest, significant and widespread opposition to the regime. opposition that has been met historically with severe and often lethal crackdowns. Neither of those two facts cancels out the other. A committed minority can still organize large, visible public displays of loyalty using state resources, material incentives, and coordinated media coverage. And a broader, quieter majority can still hold significant grievances against that same government, grievances that rarely appear on camera precisely because expressing them openly carries such serious personal risk. Understanding both of these realities simultaneously is what separates a genuinely informed view of this situation from one shaped entirely by a single viral clip stripped of context. So where does this leave the actual power struggle at the center of this story, the one between Iran's negotiating government and its hardline military wing? According to the material, this tension is unlikely to resolve quickly or quietly. The government side continues pursuing negotiations with the United States because it appears to calculate that continued confrontation poses an existential risk to the system's survival. The hardline side continues resisting those negotiations because it calculates the opposite, that any real deal threatens its own institutional power far more than continued confrontation does. Both sides remain nominally part of the same overall regime, which means this is not a conflict likely to produce a clean winner or a clear resolution anytime soon. It is more likely to continue playing out exactly the way it did at this funeral, through public friction, competing displays of loyalty, arrests that carry little real consequence, and moments of visible disorder that briefly expose the cracks in a system that spends enormous effort trying to appear unified. There is also a wider regional dimension to this story that deserves serious attention, because Iran's internal power struggle does not exist in isolation from its network of regional allies and proxy forces. According to the material, several of the armed groups and governments that Iran's Revolutionary Guard has spent decades cultivating and supporting across the wider Middle East have faced significant setbacks in the recent period, including shifts in the political situation in Syria, pressure on Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, and continued instability affecting allied factions in Gaza and Yemen. The material also references upcoming deadlines related to Iranian-aligned militia forces operating inside Iraq, tied to expectations around disarmament, suggesting that pressure on Iran's regional network extends well beyond its own borders and into the broader coalition of allied forces it has built up since the 1980s. If that broader regional network continues to weaken, it directly affects the calculation happening inside Iran's own leadership right now. The hardline faction's argument for continued confrontation rather than negotiation becomes harder to sustain if the regional support system that gave Iran leverage and strategic depth for decades keeps eroding piece by piece. At the same time, the government faction's argument for negotiation becomes more urgent, because a weakening regional position gives Iran less leverage to negotiate from, and less time to secure a deal before its bargaining position deteriorates further. This is the deeper story, hiding underneath a single chaotic afternoon at a funeral in Tehran. It is easy to watch a clip of crowds chanting, police making arrests, and disappointed attendees walking away, and see nothing more than a strange, isolated news moment. But when you understand the decades-long power struggle between Iran's civilian government and its military security apparatus, the real math behind crowd size and regime support, the active military standoff with Israel running underneath all of it, and the wider regional network that Iran's leadership has spent decades building and is now watching unravel, a very different picture comes into focus. This was not simply a funeral that got a little chaotic. It was a visible crack in a system that has spent nearly half a century projecting an image of total unity and control, a crack that appeared, unmistakably, in front of the entire world's cameras. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain. It would be irresponsible to predict a specific outcome with confidence, whether that means a real breakthrough in negotiations with the United States, a hardline faction consolidating power and shutting down the diplomatic track entirely, or a continuation of the same uneasy, unresolved standoff between both camps that has defined Iranian politics for years. What is clear is that the pressure on this system, from outside through military and diplomatic confrontation, and from inside through this long-running struggle between rival factions, is not easing. It is intensifying. And the next time that pressure becomes visible in public, it may not be contained to a single square in Tehran.